Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We will begin in 5 minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We will begin in 3 minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for one contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of continuing nursing education by the American Nurses Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation. The speakers and planning committee members have disclosed no conflicts of interest. To receive contact hours for this CNE session, participants are required to attend the webcast and complete the evaluation form, which will be emailed to all attendees approximately 1 day after the webcast. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository within a few business days of recording. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. You'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel that you can send a message through the questions feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to the presenters. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. To practice this feature, please submit the country or state you are from. We would like to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today. Our speakers are Dr. Megan Lippy and Dr. Sarah Kaler. Dr. Lippy is an assistant professor and life researcher at the University of Alabama, Capstone College of Nursing. Her area of research focuses on palliative and end-of-life care education. She has published works in areas related to palliative education, instrument development, simulation, and social justice. Dr. Sarah Kyler is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama, Capstone College of Nursing in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Her areas of teaching expertise include health assessment, fundamentals, and nurse case management. Her research interest centers upon innovations in teaching, learning, and curriculum design, and the role health and wellness behaviors play in promoting living, learning, and work environments. She is a past scholar in the Nurse Faculty Leadership Academy. We are so excited to have you both with us today. Now let's get started on today's presentation.
Thank you. This is Sarah Kaler, and I would like to just first take a moment to thank you for carving the time out of your evening to come and be with us today so that we can talk about how to provide education and leadership during this time of crisis in our country and within our local communities. We do want to note that we have no conflicts of interests and that this activity is eligible for one contact hour. Our objectives today are to talk about the different types and stages of grief specific to this pandemic crisis that we are experiencing. We want to identify strategies for responding to that loss and to develop those mechanisms for prioritizing those competing challenges that we are experiencing. Next, we also want to describe methods for fostering resilience, both within ourselves, within our peers and our colleagues, but also more importantly for our students during this time. I'd like to begin with just a story to see if you can relate this to your personal or professional life. Pictured above is a picture of the old Choluteca Bridge that was built in 1937 in Honduras. In 1996, a world-famous Japanese company began building a new bridge, and this bridge became to be known as the Bridge of the Rising Sun. It had the most up-to-date technology. It was spectacular. The Japanese company finished this bridge in 1998, so it took 2 years of blood, sweat, and tears poured into the work of this bridge. But then whenever it was finished, soon after, tragedy struck Honduras. No sooner had the bridge opened for use, Honduras was hit by the powerful and destructive Hurricane Mitch, which is recorded as the second deadliest Atlantic hurricane in history. What a tragedy. However, the biggest surprise of all of this was that the new Choluteca Bridge survived completely with only minor damage. But the roads at both ends of the bridge were completely washed out and nowhere to be found. Incredibly, though, the bridge itself remained in near perfect condition. Surprisingly, though, was that the Choluteca River, which is several hundred feet wide, had carved itself an entirely new channel due to the massive flooding, and now it no longer flowed beneath the bridge. So very quickly, this bridge became known as the Bridge to Nowhere. So just like engineers in this story, at the beginning of this academic year and in January when we started this semester, none of us could have predicted the storm that has disrupted and continues to disrupt our personal and professional everyday lives. Our new normal has carved itself different channels, and the bridges that were once functional no longer serve their original purpose. I want to share with you a few of the voices that I've heard over the weeks, and I'm wondering if you are able to relate to any of these. First, I want to hear from Larry, who is coming to us from New York State. And he states that he thinks of his former students on the front lines doing exactly what we know they left our programs prepared to do. And then he thinks of them doing this without the appropriate resources, the equipment, the tools, working in conditions that are devastating them emotionally and physically. Larry speaks to an overwhelming sense of guilt he feels because we're not standing next to them on the front lines. We're not involved in direct patient care as educators. He wants to be there with the kids, fighting this fight, comforting them when they are exhausted, making sure they are eating and drinking and taking care of themselves. Next, we're going to hear from Becky Owings. And out of her mouth, she said to her former students who are now current nursing workforce, words fail when it comes to telling you how proud we are of you. It's unfortunate it took a pandemic for society to acknowledge your greatness. You are facing something unprecedented with grace and fortitude. There is no amount of compensation that can equal your worth. One last exemplar of the sentiments that we've been hearing over the past couple weeks comes from a nurse educator who's afraid I failed you in speaking to her students. I do not doubt your knowledge and ability to be amazing nurses. I know that your supply support systems are failing you. I know that those not self-isolating and ignoring pleas to stay home are failing you. I pray that your friends and family are supporting you as best they can. I never once thought you would be in a situation where your safety would be so compromised. I wish I spent more time with you preparing you for this. As we can see, many educators around the country and the world are struggling with different emotions and are having a hard time kind of putting their finger on what it is that they're feeling currently. That discomfort that you might be feeling is grief. If you can name it, you have a better chance of managing it. People are feeling a number of things right now. The world has changed, and while we know that the pandemic itself is temporary, it doesn't feel that way yet. And we realize the effects of it will make things be different from here on out. So at this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Megan Lippy, who's going to talk to us about the different phases of grief.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us. So one of the things that we know just from the nurse education realm is that at times we don't really talk much about loss and grief. It's not necessarily something that we include in our curricula. And so I do want to spend a few minutes just kind of laying a firm foundation in what we're talking about when we say loss and grief. And then we'll explore more about how that relates to us as educators. So loss is this idea, it's this absence of an object or a position or ability. A lot of times we think of loss as loss of life, which we know we're seeing nationwide, but loss can be of anything that means something to you. As educators right now, we might be feeling loss of normalcy and routine. There's concerns about a loss of economic stability. There's loss of those connections, those personal interactions we've had, and loss of predictability. And grief is our reaction to loss, how we respond to whatever those losses are in our lives. So one of the things that I'd like us all to spend a moment thinking about is just how are we individually responding to this loss? And it's not just one, there's lots of losses coming at us right now across the board, and not just in our educator role, but in multiple ways. So as you think about how are you reacting to these losses, are you reaching out to others or are you turning more inward? Is that gotten to be to a point where you feel so overwhelmed by all of the losses that you've gone into more of a shutdown? Or is it just depends on the time of day or the day or where we're at? So there's a lot of types of grief. As we think about how are we grieving, there's more than one way to grieve, and it's unique to every single person. So there's normal grief. These are normal feelings, reactions, and behaviors to a loss. These can be physical, emotional, cognitive, or behavioral. And these are things that, again, they're normal. Grief is normal. We don't necessarily like grief, but it's normal and it's okay to be grieving. Anticipatory grief is grief that occurs before a loss. And in this time of uncertainty, there's a lot of anticipatory grief that we might be experiencing. It's this feeling we get about what the future holds when we're uncertain. We know something bad is happening and we can't quite see it or visualize it. It breaks our sense of safety and we feel that loss of safety very palpably. Acute loss is this idea of a sudden and unexpected loss, and I think there's elements of this that we're seeing in our personal lives and our professional lives. Delayed grief is this idea that reactions to a loss are postponed, that it might be consciously putting off or avoiding that, thinking through and processing that loss, or unconscious. Complicated grief has a lot of components. It's complex, but there's this sense of disbelief regarding a loss. There's anger and bitterness over that loss. There's this kind of cyclical recurrent pangs with painful emotions, intense yearning or longing for what was, and a preoccupation with thoughts of what's been lost. And disenfranchised grief. It's this grief we encounter when a loss is experienced but can't be openly acknowledged or socially sanctioned or publicly shared. So we'll talk about these more, but we're going to move to a poll. And one of the things that we've got this great painting by Salvador Dali here, and it's showing this bridge, this broken bridge, but just I feel like as educators, we're all at different stages of our grieving, and a lot of us have been called on to very quickly engage in changes to our teaching and to move to online platforms and modalities of educating our students. And in doing that, we maybe haven't done the work of grieving and even acknowledging our losses. And I think this painting shows all the different feelings we might be having right now. But we'd like you guys to take a moment and answer this poll, but based on the descriptions of these grief types, which type do you feel best represents what you are feeling as an educator at this time? All right, so it looks like we've got lots of feelings of anticipatory and complicated grief. So we'll kind of talk about those. Thank you for sharing those as well. I think one of the things, as Sarah mentioned, is that at times if you can name it, it helps us move forward. So just giving us all that opportunity to name what we're feeling, I think is really helpful as we sort of dive into these next steps. Can we go back to the slides? Great, thank you. So as we think about grief, grief is unique for every person. Every person has different losses and different responses to those losses. And we also know that there's different languages of grief and how people respond physically or verbally. And one of the things that we need to do as well is think about how we're coping with these losses. So coping is these processes or strategies for managing a situation in which we're engaging in grief. So I want to share a little bit of some theories of grief that are out there, just as a way for us to kind of couch what we're talking about. One of the things that we know, one theory out there is called the dual process model of coping with bereavement. And the important thing with this is it talks about grief as this oscillating process that we move back and forth between states of being at any given time. And there's these two orientations, one being a loss orientation, which refers to concentrating on what's been lost. So actually thinking about the loss itself, incorporating the grief work that we need to do. It involves sometimes feeling, it can be painful dwelling on or searching for that loss. And it lies at the heart of grieving. So there's this loss orientation. And then on the other side of this, we oscillate to this restoration orientation. So focusing on those stressors that can be a consequence of our grieving, but more importantly, it's this idea of reorienting ourselves in a world where this loss has occurred. So finding that new normal, rethinking and replanning our lives. And one of the things that I would submit to you as educators is I think a lot of us have in the past few weeks done a fair bit of restoration orientation and trying to figure out our path moving forward and come up with our game plans and all of our online teaching and how do we do clinical and all of these questions that are coming our way. But I would imagine a lot of us haven't spent much time in that loss orientation, grieving those losses that we've been feeling, grieving that we don't get to say goodbye to our students who are graduating, grieving the lack of interaction with our colleagues on a daily basis. Just, I think that a lot of us have sort of missed out on that, and I hope that some of the things we continue to talk about help encourage you to spend some time in that loss orientation. But with coping, one of the questions is, are we being proactive or reactive? And in the poll, a lot of people said they're feeling this anticipatory grief, this kind of grieving what's coming or knowing a loss is coming. And the research on anticipatory grief talks a lot about that through grieving and doing this work, this grief work, we can experience personal growth and this idea of post-traumatic growth. Personal growth is a person becoming more resilient and understanding themselves as well as gaining heightened empathy toward others. And post-traumatic growth is these positive changes in ways of relating to others, developing a new understanding of ourselves as stronger and more capable people, and initiating a new life adventures and gaining satisfaction. But one of the most important mediators of this whole process of coping with loss and grief is engaging with our social support. And in this time of social isolation, finding that social support and engaging with our social networks in the same way has changed. And so how are we as educators providing a social support for our students, but also using our social supports to help us through this process? The last idea with grief is stages of grief. This comes from Kubler-Ross's stages. And more recently, Kessler has added a sixth stage. And I just want to spend a little time also thinking through these. I think of all the grief theories, this is the one that's most well known. But we know there's these stages of denial where denial through anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And Kessler has added this idea of meaning, that there's this final stage of finding meaning. I would imagine that a lot of us are not at the meaning-making stage of this, but that we're at some phase along these other 5 stages. And within this, it's not a linear process. We can be all over the place and back and forth between these different feelings. But as from an educator perspective, when we think about, are we feeling denial? It's like it or not, this is really happening. So we might be denying it, but the reality is it's happening. We might be angry about all of these things that are occurring. One of the thoughts is, yeah, we can be mad, but we also have to be moving forward and getting busy with doing the work here. Bargaining, this idea, it's not my fault, but it is our problem to solve, and so we have to be strategize and prioritize how we solve these problems. Depression, there's a lot of sadness right now and a lot of stress. I know I personally feel a lot of stress right now with trying to juggle all of the things on my plate, from now being an elementary school teacher through continuing to do the courses I'm teaching and preparing for my courses for the summer that will be in a new format. Again, lots of feelings, but I'm not going to be beaten by this. And this idea of acceptance. So what are my options? This is the reality, and let's get to work. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah to give us some ideas for our strategies and how we can move forward.
Great, thank you. Hopefully by now you have kind of picked up on our theme of water and how we are trying to calm the roaring waters that are out there with so many of our nursing educators. I want you to look at this picture and kind of picture yourself, like where would you be in this boat? In times of fear and change, we know that people want answers. They need guidance. And during times of uncertainty, who do they look up to for these things? They look up to their role models, their faculty, their mentors. So I want to shift gears and talk here about leadership. Leaderships in times of uncertainty, of fear, and of change. Because as a leader, it's important to be mindful and to prepare yourself to lead during this crisis. To do that, we have to first ground ourselves. We do this by making the conscious effort to not participate in any of the drama. As we know, there's a lot of information that's floating around right now, and it's floating around through a variety of outlets. We have the news, social media, all sorts of marketing. Email boxes are filling up with every product you've ever purchased now is wanting to target you. Some of this information is accurate, most of it is not. So we need to be mindful to be careful not to get drawn into the drama. And instead, we need to focus on being the person that we want our peers and our students to be, now more than ever. Secondly, we need to be thoughtful and calm. Leaders during times of crisis point people to something larger than themselves. We know that things will get better with time, but until then, we need to do whatever it takes to get us there. Stay connected. Leaders know that spending extra time listening to the concerns and the worries of our colleagues and students is priceless. This will help them feel connected to you, to the course that you're teaching them, or to the institution that you both belong to. Listen without judgment, but also in doing so, help connect people back to reality. Remind them that they too will get to the other side of this pandemic. As part of that, we want to offer credibility. During a time of uncertainty like this, many questions are being raised, and nobody knows the answer to these questions just yet. I know personally, I'm wondering, will fall 2020 classes be online as well? Will any of our out-of-state students come back eventually to campus, or are they going to end up transferring to local home schools? Nobody knows the answer to these questions. But during that time of uncertainty, a leader can still convey confidence that regardless of the outcome, we will find our way to the other side of this. Part of that is modeling courage. A leader knows the importance of creating a sense of normalcy by carrying on business as usual. The business as usual may look slightly different now that we are in a world of remote and online learning, but that leadership requires that we move forward somehow. Refrain from the temptation to put things off or to lower your standards. If a student was in a difficult academic situation before leaving for spring break, a difficult conversation with that student still needs to be addressed. So let's talk now a little bit about strategies for responding to that loss. Sometimes when we are experiencing that loss or grief, we also have to identify and address anxiety. It's natural during times of uncertainty to find our minds wandering to those worst case scenarios or images. In fact, it would be unhealthy to ignore these anxieties altogether, because that just would create a repetitive case of unhealthy denial that Megan was talking about earlier. Instead, I think the goal is to find a balance in the things that we are thinking. If you find something that's negative, that is weighing you down, force yourself to be equally conscious about seeking out positive things that surround us daily. We've talked about anticipatory grief, and it's the mind going to the future and imagining the worst. To calm yourself, you want to be mindful of the present. Take a moment and focus on 5 things that are immediately around you. These could be your computer, a table lamp, a photo frame, a window to the outside world, and your chair. It's important to remember to breathe. Realize that in the present moment, nothing you've anticipated has happened, and you are okay. You have food, you are not sick, you are present, and you are breathing, and you will move forward out of this. Take a moment to assess your activities, both personal and professional, and prioritize what needs to be done, what would be nice to get done, and what you can let go of. Let go of what cannot be controlled. As we've mentioned earlier, there are so many nursing education products that are suddenly, very quickly being offered and available to us right now. And it's tempting to want to try them all or just a few. But you have to kind of take a minute to step back and ask yourself, do I really care about this? Chances are the answer is probably not, or else you would have already explored it earlier, pre-pandemic. So as we continue to navigate these unknown waters, it's important to be mindful that everyone's going to have a different level of fear and a different level of grief, and that this is going to manifest itself in different ways. One colleague might be a little snippy with you on the phone or in a Zoom conference meeting, or a student might seem a little distant to you while you're trying to hold a student session. But this is the perfect time to practice patience and compassion. Take into consideration who the person usually is and not who they seem to be in the moment, because it's very likely that their behavior is the outward expression of internal fear and anxiety. And then for those of us who have tried several strategies and yet still continue to feel overwhelmed at times, keep trying. Put a name to what you are feeling and share that with those around you. It's okay to let your colleagues know that you're having a tough time today, or to be vulnerable with your students and let them know you're struggling in the moment, trying to balance multiple and competing roles. Whatever it is, just name it. Acknowledge what you're feeling so that you can channel that emotion into motion, which leads to empowerment. So in talking about resilience, we want to first define what resilience is. And resilience is the ability to bounce back, adapt to stress and adversity, and thrive after being involved in particularly stressful situations. Resilience has been defined as a trait, it's been defined as a process, a quality that somebody possesses, or an attribute, but it's also been defined as a psychological category. We know that resilient individuals tend to exhibit an internal locus of control and are often empathetic and have positive self-image and optimism. Several factors have been identified as crucial for developing of resilience, and many of these are protective factors that are inherent traits, and they serve to defend us as individuals against those adverse effects. Coping strategies, particularly our stress reduction strategies and techniques, are what's been shown to enhance and foster resilience in individuals. We know that research demonstrates that positive coping mechanisms allow individuals to use personal strengths to overcome trauma and stress. So how do we foster that resilience in ourselves and our peers during this time of crisis? Again, now is the time more than ever before to be compassionate, but to be compassionate with others as well as ourselves. At the beginning of the semester, we did not sign up for building an online class quickly and emergently. We are not teaching students who can be expected to be ready to learn online. And as humbling as it may be, your class is not the highest priority of your students' lives or your life right now, to be honest. So the point is, don't fuss too much about recording your lectures or your videos. You don't need to take time out to edit the ums, or if your doorbell happens to ring in the background. Editing is a complete waste of your time right now. Release yourself from high expectations right now because that's the best way to help your students learn. As you start to move your classes online, and many of us have already done so, as you start to do that, many students are going to be accessing the internet on their phones and most likely with limited data. So keep in mind that they're going to be reserving this data for things that are more important than your online lectures. Students are also going to be sharing their technology with other household members. So in actuality, they may now have less time to do their schoolwork instead of more. In nursing education, and particularly in terms of graduate education, many students are going to be working more, not fewer, hours now that they might be getting called to the front lines. And then lastly, some of our peers and our students and even yourself, like we are going to eventually get sick, and others are going to be caring for people who are ill. Many of us are also going to be challenged by doing this while also parenting. So to develop this student resilience during this time of crisis, for most of us, I would be willing to bet that most of our student population that we have would fall under either the millennial generation or the Generation Z, that is the up and coming. We know that millennials are kind of phasing out and Generation Z students are phasing in. And I think it's important to take into account these generational characteristics, because it's going to help understand students and put them where they are, meet them with where they are. We know that many of our millennial students are associated with short attention spans, some impatience, and they often have that achievement orientation in which everybody wins. Many of these millennials have now entered into the nursing workplace. And in the workplace environment, millennials tend to want open and constant communication and are especially interested in that positive reinforcement from their boss or supervisor. This generation has the mindset of work to live rather than live to work. Our Generation Z, on the other hand, has typically been connected in a seamless world of friends and data and entertainment. The transition to online learning for our Generation Z has probably been easier for them than their millennial counterparts, because Generation Z is actually the most homeschooled generation in the modern public school era. Therefore, Generation Z typically requires less direction, and a lot of this is because they have ready access to digital tools, such as ebooks and e-learning and all of these different types of technologies that are available online. This can have a downfall effect for them, though, because it enables those Generation Z students to think that they can do just about anything. We also know from early characteristics of this generation that Gen Z is driven by graphics. They expect instant feedback on their performance, and interestingly enough, they want to know how they can perfect it. They're not interested in just improving it. They want to know how they can be perfect at their performance. Therefore, they prefer customized learning. They want a learning solution that is unique and customized and tailored to themselves. So a downfall to all of this technology and connectivity is that our Generation Z students are finding themselves with little to zero downtime. And this can contribute to no depth of thought or opportunity for self-reflection. So given the generational characteristics and differences, one of the concerns is the social isolation that is occurring as an effect of our social distancing that's being mandated right now. So social isolation can contribute to mental health problems. It can contribute to domestic violence. And we also know that during this time right now of mandated stay-at-home orders, students are also going to be losing their jobs. That's especially true in cases of students who are in hospitality or retail elements. So all of these factors mean that your students now are facing more important battles today than your class, even if they are able to access your class. So with that, to help them build resilience during this time, you may want to consider a little hand-holding. I know that this feels counterintuitive and it is going against the independence that we are trying to establish in our next generation of nurses. But let's be honest, don't you appreciate a text reminder from your dentist that you have an appointment tomorrow? I know I do. So as you put your materials online, within your learning management system, it's easy to create announcements. It's easy to create reminders to remind these students that due dates, and if you can do so and remind them about 24 hours before the date is due, that would be ideal during this time of information overload. At this point, I think it's okay to not do too much because right now your students don't need it. Instead, they need time to do the other things that they need to do to take care of their world. Lastly, listen for what they need. Listen to them when they are asking for help. Our students, many of them have never encountered anything on this level. Many of us have never encountered anything on this level. So it's understandable that our students may be anxious. They may be tired. Many students are returning to their parents' homes where they may not be welcome. Others might be returning to a home with partners who are violent, and school has always been a safe place for them. So your class may matter a lot to them when they are able to focus on it, but it might not matter that much right now in contrast to all the other things that they are having to deal with. So don't let that hurt your feelings, and definitely don't hold that against them in the future semesters when they come back or if they ever reach out to you for a letter of recommendation. So in this time, we've had the opportunity to talk a little bit about the different stages of grief, and hopefully we've been able to kind of identify what it is that we collectively as nurse educators are feeling in relations to our students, our peers, ourselves. We've talked about the different stages of grief and loss and how we can provide leadership during a time of fear, a time of crisis, and a time of uncertainty. Because regardless of your position or your role at your organization, you are a leader and you are leading someone, or someone is looking up to you. So we've talked about strategies for how we can implement that, and also how we can start looking at this from a framework of resilience and developing that resilience within ourselves and helping to foster that within our peers and our colleagues, but as well as time to foster that within our students. So in following our theme of water, I'm hopeful that now we are seeing that it is possible that some of the waters are calming, and we are starting to realize that we will get to the other side of this pandemic, and we are all going to come out of this okay. It's just going to take a few little stepping stones along the way, and we will all get there, and hopefully we will get there sooner rather than later. So at this time, I invite and I open the floor up for any potential questions or discussion that you all may have. We would love to hear where you are and meet you where you are.
Sarah and Megan, just as you had mentioned several stages of grief, an attendee would like everyone to know there's also cumulative grief and grief overload. Many of us will experience this as well. This brings me to my first question. How do I not let my grief run over into my teaching? How do I stay positive for my students?
I think one of the things to consider is that part of it is okay for that to have a place in your teaching, not be the overriding piece of it for sure. But I think we feel as educators that we have to always have this front of, I've got myself together and I'm cool, calm, and collected. And the reality is that that's not always going to be the case, especially now that I think it's okay for us to role model that we are experiencing grief and how we are coping with it. So I would encourage us to not feel like we have to completely separate that out and have, our teacher face that is very stoic and collected. But also at the same time, we can't have complete come aparts in front of our students. That wouldn't be fostering leadership. So I would say that kind of as the first piece. And Erica, can you remind me part B? I'm sorry. What was the second part of that? I'm sorry.
How do you suggest that I stay positive for my students?
I think, thank you, by the way, and thank you also for mentioning the other types of grief. One of the things in terms of staying positive, like I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of us, I feel it very viscerally that, we were asked to take on this mantle of moving online very rapidly, and the deadlines were there. It wasn't necessarily like we could ignore those. Maybe some of us got an extra week to do that work and figure out how to deploy our class online and figure out all of the pieces of this. But I would submit, again, I feel that a lot of us skipped over an important piece of allowing these emotions to be experienced and lived. And I think a lot of us have not given ourselves time to do the grieving. We very quickly found ourselves in a new world with our kids are now at home and schools are closed and teaching is online, and there's so many changes. But I would say first, in order for us to be positive, it's important for us to first take that time to do this grief work. And it might not be that you have this unlimited amount of time, but spending a little bit of time acknowledging these feelings that we're having. And then, so doing that grief work, allowing ourselves to just be in those moments of feeling what we're feeling, and then reframing it and trying to think about, okay, so yes, I am feeling really overwhelmed right now, but what's one thing I could do to move myself forward? And then, that allows us to kind of reframe and move into a more positive perspective. But it would be really hard for anybody to be fully positive with our students if we haven't allowed ourselves to really process through what all's happened. And so I would say first we have to do the grief work, and then we can try to be positive. If we skip that, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and also to our students.
I just want to remind you guys to keep sending in those questions. You guys had mentioned students feeling anxious. What if I am also feeling anxious? How do I lead them when I am experiencing the same thing?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I have had those moments myself where you just have the moments of anxiety and that overwhelming sense of all the things that you have to do professionally, but also all of the things that you have to do personally. I think, again, it all goes back to putting a name to it. Because once you name that emotion, you can do something about it. So recognizing the anxiety, and that's where the coping strategies and the stress techniques that we teach our students about self-care come into play. When you're feeling those moments of anxiety, take a deep breath, step back from the situation, go for a walk and confide in a friend if you can. All of those are healthy mechanisms for stress and for coping that we teach our students to do within the clinical setting. I think that's important to now. We have to walk the walk, and the things that we teach our students to manage stress are the things that we need to be implementing within our own lives. I think that this is the perfect plug for self-care. We need to be mindful of what we are doing within our own quarantined walls of our homes. Are we promoting a sense of calm? Are we promoting an environment of chaos? I know that many of us are struggling with competing demands of now roles of caregiver and homeschooler and educator, and also having to compete demands with spouses who are working from home. And this is unprecedented, uncharted waters. But if we can find a way to schedule our time or to become centered or to reach out to one another and ask for help when we need help, all of these are healthy opportunities for us to cope with that anxiety so that it doesn't put us in that fight or flight mode where our cortisol levels are just going berserk. So I would say, definitely this is a perfect hands-on teaching opportunity for you to model and recognize for your students that, hey, I'm stressed, you're stressed, we're all stressed, but these are things we can do together to get over this anxiety. I hope that's helpful.
I feel guilty for not being on the front lines when I have the skills to serve. Should I return or stay in education?
I think this is something that is shared collectively by many of us. I know from a personal standpoint, my background is trauma surgical intensive care nursing. And when all of this came about, I definitely had that sense of feeling the need to be called elsewhere, wanting to get my hands dirty, wanting to go back into the clinical setting and having that hands-on patient care. And I think that that was even one of the things that was expressed earlier in the anecdotes that we shared in a previous slide, is that sense of overwhelming guilt, kind of almost not only guilt for yourself or guilt for your immediate patients, but guilt to the profession of, I have this skill set and it's needed and it's needed desperately, but I can't contribute right now because I don't work for a hospital. I work for an education institution. I think that those are normal feelings to associate with the different types of grief. In and of itself, you're grieving your loss of a bedside nurse. And when you put that into perspective and remind yourself, like we were talking about earlier, you want to balance those thoughts. When you have that negative image of, I should be working at the front lines or I could do so much more, balance that with a positive. And you and the things that you are doing now in your educator role are equally valuable and equally needed, because you are preparing the workforce that is going to take care of everybody 6 months from now, a year from now, into the future. The role that you are doing right now as a nurse educator for your current students, you can now take this as an active learning opportunity and prepare those students for the crises that may come into their lives. So I think it's important to not fall into the trap of thinking that just because we as nurse educators are not on the front line, we're not doing anything, because we absolutely are. We are preparing the next generation. And if you were to remove yourself from education and go to the front line, then you're doing a disservice to your current students and the students who need you now. So you are just as needed here in the education classroom as you are on the front lines.
Thank you. Next question. When I handle grief, I tend to shut down, but I need to keep going. I need to keep teaching. Do you have any additional resources you can share, especially during this time of being away from others?
Absolutely. It can be this feeling of being shut down. And at times we do need to not completely shut down, but we do need to have some time to just sit with this. I know personally, I have times where I just need to kind of shut down some of my roles. Like, okay, I can't do everything right now. I need to put aside the educator hat, or I need to, ask my husband to be the sole caregiver for a little bit as I take some me time. But yes, we do then have to move forward. But again, I think one of the things we feel very pressured to do right now in response to the crisis is just move on. I think a lot of us feel like we have to get to this stage of acceptance and having found meaning in this, but not let us go through all of the other stages of grief, or not letting us think through all of these emotions. But I would say if you are feeling shut down and you feel like maybe some of your coping strategies that you used before aren't maybe working in the same way, I would say one step would be to reach out. What we see with grief, that social support is so important. When we think in the bereavement world, a lot of times we encourage people who've lost a loved one to engage in support groups. And this is not even just with death and dying, but we see support groups with substance abuse and with other things. So we know that that support is so important. And so I think at times we could find ourselves in this time of social isolation, feeling like we have to do this on our own, that we need to be isolated, but that would be the time to reach out, and not necessarily reach out to everybody, but who is that trusted person in your life who you could go to and say, I'm feeling shut down, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling all these things, and just have that sounding board, because we need that. And I think too, as educators and as colleagues, we might have people coming to us saying these things, and I would encourage us to be real mindful of this idea of presence that we use. We teach this a lot in the palliative care world, but just that idea of being with somebody and being present for them in these moments can be meaningful. And no, we can't maybe physically be present with one another, but how could I be present with my colleague at that time who's really struggling or feeling shut down? Could I, if they call me on the phone, can I have a meaningful conversation? Can I step away and give them my time? So I think there's both sides of that. But if you're feeling like you're drowning, if we're going to keep with our water analogy here, it's okay to ask for a life raft from someone who you feel safe doing that with.
How do you handle the challenges of our new roles? We are educators teaching online, but at home we are parenting, teaching our children. How do we handle this new stress? How do we balance it all?
I think that it's important to get organized and to give ourselves plenty of grace and plenty of mercy. Jokingly, whenever my children's school announced that fifth grade and pre-K was going to be no longer face-to-face instruction and that I was now responsible for homeschooling them, I jokingly asked if this was something that I could put on my CV as fifth grade educator and pre-K educator and add that to my skill set. I think it's an opportunity for us to extend ourselves some grace. Um, we are overwhelmed. We are balancing multiple roles, multiple positions, things that we have never had to do before because we've had the blessings of school systems, the blessings of daycare support, the blessings of being able to leave your house to go to work. That seems so strange to say now, but 3 weeks ago I never would have believed that. But it's a blessing to get out of the house to go to work. So extend yourself some grace. Extend yourself that opportunity to create a schedule that works for you with your unique situation, that works for your family. It might be that your productivity drops, and I think that that is okay. It might be that your spouse or your partner is going to have to decide whose work day is more important in which hour and whose meeting is more important. It might be, letting your kids have a little bit more screen time than you normally would have. I think that all of these are things that we are doing right now because we're in survival mode and reminding ourselves that this too shall pass. We are going to get to the other side of this, and our kids and our spouses are going to be okay as a result of this. We're still going to raise healthy and productive children who are going to contribute to society in a way that is still maintaining a sense of humor and resilience. So again, kind of going back to that anticipatory grief, worrying about what's going to happen to the futures of our children, the futures of our marriages as a result of this, Let's focus on the mindful present. Let's see what are the things that we can do right now, today, within this hour, to center and to be balanced and to be focused on what's right for us in this moment. And I think that that's probably the most helpful technique possible.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to our presenters today for all the great information. Sigma is grateful that you took the time to share with this audience, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. As a reminder to attendees, can you share the country or state you are from? And thank you to our attendees for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening.